Christmas dinner was supposed to be peaceful, the first one since my father's passing. Instead, it became the night my mother erased me from her life, with a single sentence that cut deeper than any knife. The house on Beacon Hill glowed like something out of a magazine, spread garlands, laced with gold ribbon crystal ornaments catching the firelight, a dining table set for perfection. But under all that sparkle, the air felt sharp, electric, ready to snap. My mother, Margaret Carter, sat at the head of the table, a glass of red wine poised elegantly in her manicured hand. Across from her, my brother Nathan scrolled through his phone, pretending not to exist. I had been waiting all evening for the right moment, believing naively that maybe, just maybe, this Christmas would be different. That grief might have softened her, that the absence of my father might have opened something human in her. When dessert was cleared, I finally said it. "Mom, I have news. I'm pregnant." The silver fork in her hand froze midair. She looked up, her smile brittle as glass. "You're what Daniel and I are expecting," I said, trying to steady my voice. She took a slow sip of wine before answering. "I don't want you or that bastard in this family. You're cut out of the will." Silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The only sound was the soft ticking of the antique clock above the mantel. My throat went dry, my heart pounded so hard it made my vision blur. Nathan didn't look up. Aunt Susan shifted uncomfortably, her fork clinking against the china. My mother set her glass down and folded her napkin with surgical precision, as if she'd just discussed the weather. I sat there for 3 seconds. 1, 2, 3, then pushed back my chair. "Merry Christmas, Mother," I said quietly. I reached into my bag, took out the small wrapped box I'd spent weeks preparing, and placed it under the glittering tree. Then I turned and walked toward the door, heels clicking against the marble floor. No one stopped me. No one even breathed. Outside, snow drifted in lazy circles, catching the streetlight like tiny shards of glass. My breath came out in white clouds. Behind me, the house stood glowing and perfect, a monument to everything hollow. I pulled my coat tighter and kept walking. Daniel's name flashed across my phone. "How's dinner?" he asked, his voice warm and familiar. "Dinner's over," I said, watching the lights of the city blur through the falling snow. He paused. "That bad worse?" I didn't tell him what she said. Not yet. I wasn't ready to hear the words out loud again. Instead, I looked back once more at that beautiful house, wondering how something so polished could hide so much rot underneath. She'd always won every argument. But not this one. The wind bit at my face as I walked toward my car, parked 2 blocks away. Each step felt like shedding another layer of the person she'd tried to make me: obedient, quiet, desperate for approval. I wasn't her perfect daughter anymore. Maybe I never had been. When I started the engine, the dashboard lights flickered to life, casting the cabin in a soft blue glow. My hands trembled on the steering wheel, not from cold, but from the shock that hadn't yet settled. She had said it so calmly, as though cutting me off, disowning her only daughter, was an administrative decision. "You're cut out of the will," the phrase echoed rhythmic and cruel. "People think money is the wound. It isn't. It's what the words mean. You don't belong. You're not family anymore." The snow thickened as I drove through the quiet Boston streets. Christmas lights blinked from every window, families gathering inside warm living rooms, laughter muffled by glass. I passed a couple walking arm in arm, their breath rising together in the cold, and for a moment envy pierced me how easy love seemed for other people. My phone buzzed again. Daniel this time just sent a heart emoji and a simple "drive safe." It was the kind of quiet love that healed instead of hurt. I focused on that as I drove north, away from Beacon Hill, away from her world. Margaret Carter had built her life around control. Control over appearances, over her children, over the image of perfection she curated for the city's social pages. After my father died 2 years ago, she became even more ruthless about preserving the Carter name. She hosted galas, charity luncheons, made sure everyone remembered she was the widow of Harold Carter, the real estate magnate who had built half of Boston. And then there was Nathan, her golden boy. 27, unemployed, still living in her brownstone under the guise of finding himself. She funded his lifestyle with the same hand that slapped me with judgment every time I showed independence. He could crash cars, skip work interviews, blow through credit cards, and she'd still call him her sweet boy. Me, I was the disappointment. The daughter who became a nurse, instead of a lawyer, who dated a man from the wrong side of the river, who refused to attend her precious country club dinners. Margaret, I whispered under my breath as I drove past the Charles River. The city skyline shimmered across the water. You've finally done it. For years I'd been trying to make her proud. Every A I earned, every late night at St. Francis Hospital, every patient I stayed with long after my shift ended, it was all an unspoken plea. See me, love me, please. But nothing I did was ever enough. My success embarrassed her. My compassion made me soft. I could still hear her voice from when I first told her about Daniel. A tattoo artist, Emily. Do you even hear yourself? You have a master's degree in nursing. You could marry a surgeon, a banker, anyone respectable. And you bring home this. This was Daniel, steady, kind, funny, with hands that created beauty out of scars. He was the only man who'd ever looked at me and seen a person, not a resume. He didn't care that my family had money. He cared that I loved kids, that I volunteered at the hospital's children's wing on my days off, that I snorted when I laughed too hard. Maybe that's what she couldn't stand. Love she couldn't buy. The wipers squeaked across the windshield, pushing aside the snow. My stomach tightened. Beneath the anger was something raw grief. Not for the loss of the money or the inheritance or the house, but for the final confirmation that my mother's love had always been conditional. I turned onto my street, the small apartment Daniel and I shared, already glowing with warm yellow light. When I stepped inside, he was sitting on the couch in a paint-splattered hoodie, a cup of cocoa in hand. He looked up, worry softening his features. She did something, didn't she? I managed a nod. Yeah, something final. He stood, wrapping his arms around me. For the first time that night, I let myself breathe. You don't have to tell me yet, he whispered into my hair. Just, you're home now. Home. The word hit me in the chest. I wasn't sure where home had been before that moment, but right then, it was here. Later, when he went to bed, I sat by the window, watching snow coat the cars below. My reflection stared back, tired eyes, trembling lips, a faint shadow of defiance I hadn't seen before. She thought cutting me out of the will would break me. But she had no idea what I'd left under that perfect Christmas tree. Inside that small, glittering box was the truth she'd spent her entire life running from, and once she opened it, nothing about the Carter family would ever look perfect again. I couldn't sleep that night. The Christmas lights from the window blinked faintly against the wall, casting red and green shadows that pulsed like a heartbeat. My body was still heavy with the weight of what had happened at that dinner table. Every word my mother said kept replaying in my mind, cold, precise, deliberate. Somewhere between exhaustion and disbelief, I began to trace the path that had led us here, to this moment where mother and daughter sat on opposite ends of a war neither of us had wanted to name. I used to believe my mother's cruelty was her way of protecting me, that her sharp words were meant to toughen me for the world. But the truth was simpler and darker. Her love had always been conditional. The rot began 2 years ago, right after my father died. My father, Harold Carter, had been the calm between every storm. He built Carter Realty Holdings from the ground up in the 70s, turning a few rental homes into an empire of Boston brownstones. He believed in hard work and decency, and he treated the janitor the same way he treated his lawyers. He was the only reason my mother's world functioned. When he died, her control snapped like a cable under too much weight. The day after the funeral, she sat at his mahogany desk, flipping through his will with a glass of brandy beside her. I stood behind her, numb, expecting grief. What I saw instead was calculation. You knew about this, she asked, voice like ice. I shook my head. He split everything, evenly, between the two of you. Of course he did, I said quietly. That's fair. Her eyes lifted to mine, sharp and angry. Fair. You think it's fair that your brother who will inherit this company gets the same as a nurse? I blinked. He didn't say who would inherit the company, Mom. He just wanted us both provided for. She slammed the papers down. You've never understood. This family has an image. We built something worth protecting. And your father just gave it away to a girl who spends her days cleaning other people's messes. That was the first time she ever made my profession sound like dirt under her shoes. I left her study shaking, but I told myself it was grief talking, that she didn't mean it. Months passed, and I tried to rebuild something that resembled a relationship. I'd stop by her house after work with flowers sometimes, with takeout from her favorite French restaurant. She always received me with the same polite distance, as though I were a guest she hadn't wanted to invite. Every conversation found its way back to money or appearances, or Nathan. Nathan was 27, still living in the same house, the self-proclaimed golden boy of the Carter legacy. He spent his days networking, which meant late breakfasts at country clubs and endless hours of video games. Every mistake he made was a phase. Every failure was forgiven before it even registered. My mother adored him because he never challenged her, never broke the illusion of her perfect family. I remember one evening sitting in the kitchen while she poured herself another glass of wine. Nathan is talking about joining the firm, she said. Good, I replied, trying to sound encouraging. He could use a little structure. She looked at me over the rim of her glass. You could learn something from him. He knows how to stay close to his family. I swallowed hard, pressing my palms against my knees to keep from reacting. He also knows how to use your credit cards. Her smile vanished. Don't be cruel, Emily. He's just trying to find his path. And what am I doing? Her tone sharpened. You're wasting your education, that's what. You could be managing something, not working 12-hour shifts in scrubs. I stood up and reached for my coat. Some of us prefer helping people to managing them. Her voice followed me down the hall, cold and clipped. Helping people doesn't buy houses, darling. That was how it always went. Small cuts, one after another, until I stopped visiting at all. And then came Daniel. It was almost poetic that I met him at St. Francis Hospital, the place that had become both sanctuary and battlefield for me. He came in one rainy afternoon with a bandaged hand bleeding through the gauze, stubbornly refusing to go to the ER. When I unwrapped it, I saw a jagged cut running across the palm, the kind of wound that came from a tattoo needle accident gone wrong. He grinned when I scolded him. Guess that's what I get for rushing an outline. You're a tattoo artist, guilty. His voice was calm, steady, with a low laugh that didn't sound rehearsed. By the time I finished cleaning and stitching the wound, I'd forgotten why I was in such a hurry to leave that day. He came back a week later for a follow-up, then 2 weeks later with coffee, then again with a sketchbook full of designs. He wasn't like anyone I'd known. My mother's friends bragged about vacation homes and golf tournaments. Daniel talked about people, his clients, their scars, their stories. He said tattooing wasn't about rebellion, it was about transformation. People walk in wanting to cover something, he told me once, but what they really want is to turn pain into art. I didn't realize he was describing me. The first time I brought him to dinner, I knew it was a mistake the moment we stepped through the front door. My mother greeted him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Nathan snickered from the couch, whispering something I couldn't hear. At the table, she served roast duck and Chardonnay like a queen hosting a peasant. So Daniel, she said sweetly, how long do you plan on drawing on people for a living? He smiled, unbothered. As long as people keep wanting stories on their skin. How charming, she murmured, slicing her meat with delicate precision. My father would have changed the subject, but he wasn't there. After dinner, while Daniel waited in the car, she cornered me in the kitchen. He's not one of us, Emily. You can't build a future with someone who doesn't understand what it means to carry this name. I turned plate still in my hands. You mean someone who doesn't worship it? Her eyes flashed. Don't confuse rebellion for love. That's exactly what I think you've done, I said, and walked out before she could answer. That night, Daniel asked me if I was okay. I said yes, but something inside me had cracked open. I had seen it clearly. My mother's love wasn't love at all. It was ownership. Over the next few months, her calls became less frequent, her tone colder. When she did speak to me, it was to remind me that time is ticking or good matches don't wait forever. I stopped correcting her. Nathan continued to bask in her glow, drifting through life with her wallet in his pocket. I used to resent him, but now I just pitied him. He had no idea what it felt like to stand alone, to fight for a self that wasn't defined by her rules. Sometimes late at night, I'd read my father's last letter. He'd written it a week before his heart attack, not knowing it would be his goodbye. Be kind, even when kindness costs you everything. I used to think he meant patience. Now I knew he meant courage. I folded the letter, slid it back into the drawer, and stared out the window where the city lights blurred into gold and gray. That dinner with Daniel had been the night my mother's contempt took root. I just hadn't realized how deep it would grow or how far I would have to go to cut it out. If only I had known then that love and loyalty were about to be tested in ways I couldn't yet imagine. Love with Daniel didn't arrive like a storm. It unfolded slowly, quietly, like sunlight creeping into a cold room. After that disastrous dinner with my mother, I found myself drawn to the steadiness in him, the way he made space for silence without needing to fill it. While the world around me judged, calculated, and whispered, Daniel simply existed with a kind of peace I'd never known. We started spending weekends exploring the parts of Boston my family pretended didn't exist. Street fairs, tiny coffee shops tucked between brick buildings, thrift stores where he bought old sketchbooks for $1 and filled them with drawings of people we saw. He'd point at strangers and whisper stories about their lives, half true, half imagined. I would laugh until my sides hurt, realizing it was the first real laughter I'd had in years. Daniel's apartment sat above a bakery in Dorchester, the kind of place that smelled perpetually of sugar and smoke. He didn't have a dishwasher or expensive furniture, but he had color everywhere framed, prints-painted canvases, stacks of ink bottles, and a small radio, always humming old blues songs. One evening when I came over after a long hospital shift, he had candles lit and pasta boiling. "You didn't have to cook," I said. "I didn't," he grinned. "I'm bribing you. You look like you've had a week from hell." We sat on the couch eating from mismatched bowls, watching snow fall outside his window. For once I wasn't thinking about what I was supposed to say or how I looked. It felt easy, dangerously easy. After dinner, he showed me his latest tattoo design, of phoenix wings unfurling in shades of crimson and gold. "I drew this for someone who lost her mother," he said softly. "She wanted something to remind her that pain doesn't mean the end." I remember tracing the edges of the bird with my finger. "It's beautiful." He looked at me for a long moment, and there was something in his eyes that felt like understanding, like he saw through every layer I'd built to protect myself. "You ever think about getting one?" he asked. "Maybe someday," I said, "when I finally know who I am." He smiled. "You'll know, maybe sooner than you think." It wasn't long before he invited me to meet his family. I tried to hide my nerves as we pulled up to a modest 2-story home with chipped paint and flowers blooming wildly along the porch. His mother Lucia opened the door before we even knocked. "Mi casa es tu casa," she said, hugging me so tight I almost forgot to breathe. She smelled of cinnamon and fabric softener. His father Carlos was quieter but warm. He shook my hand, then asked if I liked enchiladas. By the time we sat down to dinner, any trace of awkwardness had dissolved. The Morales home buzzed with conversation and laughter, with teasing that came from affection, not expectation. When Lucia asked about my family, I hesitated. "We're complicated," I said. She patted my hand gently. "Aren't all families?" After dinner, Carlos insisted we stay for dessert. They told stories about Daniel's childhood, how he once tried to tattoo a dragon on the family dog, how he failed miserably at baking but still managed to burn water. I laughed so hard I nearly cried. Driving home that night, Daniel said quietly, "I know what you're thinking." "What am I thinking?" "That families like mine shouldn't make you feel more at home than your own." I didn't answer, but the silence was enough. Days turned into weeks, and our lives began to weave together in small, tender ways. He'd bring me breakfast on my overnight shifts, leave doodles in my locker, or show up at the hospital just to walk me home. When I was tired, he'd draw on my wrist with a pen, a heart, a word, a symbol, and say, "For strength." One Sunday afternoon, we sat by the Charles River watching the light ripple over the water. He talked about wanting to open his own studio someday, a place where art wasn't about rebellion but renewal. I listened, my head resting on his shoulder, and thought how different this was from every conversation I'd ever had at my mother's table. No performance, no pretending. Just honesty. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being measured. Of course, peace never lasts long in the Carter family. It started with a phone call. My mother's voice was clipped, controlled the way it always got before she said something cruel. "Emily, I saw you in the paper, a photo of you and that artist. Apparently, the tattoo community is quite the new elite in Boston." It was a local story about small businesses, I said. "They mentioned the hospital fundraiser." "Well," she replied, "one of us has to keep the family relevant." I could hear ice clinking in her glass. Then she said, "I'm having people over next Saturday. You should come, alone." I almost laughed. "Why?" "So you can parade me as your charity case." "Don't be ridiculous," she said. "I just don't want you to embarrass yourself." That was the moment I realized she wasn't embarrassed by Daniel. She was embarrassed by me, by the version of me that no longer needed her approval. The following week, I agreed to attend one of her charity galas, just to prove I wasn't hiding. I wore a simple black dress, my hair in loose curls. Daniel wanted to come, but I told him it was better if I handled it alone. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and whispers. Women in pearls kissed the air beside each other's cheeks. My mother floated among them, her smile flawless, her glass never empty. When she spotted me, she waved me over one hand, on the arm of a young man in a navy suit. "Emily, this is Dr. Blake Reynolds," she announced, like she was unveiling a prize. "He's just returned from a medical fellowship in Zurich." I smiled politely. "Nice to meet you." Dr. Reynolds smiled back, completely oblivious to the theater playing out. "Your mother tells me you're in nursing. Admirable profession." I wanted to disappear. My mother leaned closer to him. "She's very compassionate. Always has been. But she could use some stability." The word hit like a dart. I excused myself, muttering something about needing air. Outside, snow was falling again, soft and relentless. I stood under the awning, breathing hard. Daniel's name lit up my phone. "Hey," he said. "You okay?" "Not really. I'm on my way." He found me 15 minutes later, still standing outside the hotel, my heels buried in slush. He didn't ask questions. He just took off his coat and wrapped it around my shoulders. "I shouldn't have come," I whispered. "She'll never see me for who I am." "Then stop waiting for her to look," he said gently. "You don't need her eyes to exist." That night when he drove me home, I watched his reflection in the window. The quiet strength in his hands, the softness in his eyes. I realized I'd been looking for this kind of love my entire life. Love that didn't demand performance. Love that didn't require permission. A week later, my mother called again. Her voice was calm, too calm. "Emily, I hope you enjoyed yourself at the gala. I heard you left early." "I did." "Well," she said, "perhaps you'll think more carefully about your choices next time. This phase with Daniel won't last. You'll thank me when it's over." "I don't think I will," I replied. There was a pause. "You sound so certain." "I am." Another pause. Then a sigh. "You're making a mistake you'll regret." I smiled, even though she couldn't see me. "Maybe. But it'll be mine." When I hung up, I felt lighter than I had in years. That night, Daniel took me to his studio. Just an empty space he'd rented, walls freshly painted white. He handed me a marker. "Here," he said. "First line belongs to you." I wrote our initials inside a small heart on the wall. He laughed, drawing wings around it. "So you remember you can fly," he said. And I did. For the first time, I truly believed it. I didn't know that the next time we sat at a dinner table with my mother, everything would come crashing down. But in that moment, standing in that little studio surrounded by fresh paint, and hope it felt like the beginning of something unbreakable. Daniel proposed on an ordinary Tuesday night, the kind of evening when the world felt half asleep. The snow outside our apartment window blurred the city lights, and the smell of garlic and butter filled the kitchen. I was chopping vegetables while he talked about his day, something about a client who wanted a phoenix wrapped around an old scar. He went quiet mid-sentence, his hands still dusted with flour. When I looked up, he was holding a small velvet box, his expression calm but his eyes trembling. "Emily," he said softly, "I can't imagine my life without you in it. Will you marry me?" There were no grand gestures, no music swelling in the background. Just us, the hum of the refrigerator, and a simple question that felt like a lifeline. The ring wasn't big, an oval stone set in gold, delicate and handmade. It was perfect. "Yes," I whispered before he could even finish breathing. I didn't need time to think. I already knew. He laughed almost in disbelief, then slid the ring onto my finger. We stood there for a while, smiling like two fools who'd found the secret to happiness. Later that night, lying beside him, I stared at the ceiling and thought, maybe this is what freedom feels like. When I called my mother the next morning, I expected disbelief. What I didn't expect was the cold silence that followed after I said Daniel and I are engaged. For 10 seconds she said nothing. Then, in a measured tone that could slice glass, she asked, "You can't be serious." "I am," I said. "He's everything I've ever wanted. Everything," she repeated, her voice cracking into a sharp laugh. "Emily, marrying him will destroy everything your father built. Do you have any idea what people will say?" "I don't care what people will say," I replied. "Well, you should," she snapped. "Happiness doesn't pay mortgages or reputational debts. You're throwing away generations of dignity for someone who draws on people for a living." "His name is Daniel," I said quietly, "and I love him." "Love," she said, almost spitting the word. "Love is for children. You need stability. You need class. You need to stop making a spectacle of yourself." "I'm not asking for permission," I said, my voice shaking. There was a long pause and then the click of disconnection. The next day an email arrived. The subject line read, "Before you ruin your life." It was 4 paragraphs long, a list of bullet points explaining why Daniel was unsuitable, why marriage should be a strategic alliance, not an emotional gamble. The last line read, "If you go through with this, consider yourself excluded from the Carter inheritance." I stared at that word, excluded. It felt colder than any winter I'd ever known. Daniel found me staring at the screen, eyes glassy. "What is it?" I turned the laptop toward him. He read in silence, then closed it gently and looked at me. "You don't have to fight for their love. You already have mine." He said it so simply that it broke me open. 3 days later, I decided to face her in person. When I arrived, the house was alive with the hum of preparation. Servers darted through the hallways, arranging china and silverware. My mother stood in the center of it all, directing like a general before battle. "You picked a bad day," she said, without looking up. "I'm hosting the Women's League in an hour. This will only take a minute." She sighed dramatically and turned to me, her face perfectly composed. "Let me guess, you've come to tell me I'm wrong." "No," I said. "I came to tell you I'm getting married whether you approve or not." Her lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "And how exactly do you plan to live, Emily?" "On Love and Ink, I plan to live on my own terms," I said, surprising even myself. She reached for a magazine on the table and tossed it toward me. It was folded open to a local feature about Daniel's studio. "Street art goes mainstream." His photo took up half the page. "Do you see this?" she hissed. "Do you have any idea what people will think when they see our name connected to this?" "My friends have already been calling, asking if it's true." "Maybe you should tell them it is," I said. "You ungrateful child," she said, voice trembling. "Everything you have came from this family. And everything I am came from myself, I said, turning toward the door. Emily, she called after me. You walk out that door and you're no longer a Carter. I looked back just long enough to say, then maybe I was never meant to be. That was the last time I stepped into that house as her daughter, but the ripples spread fast. Nathan called that night, pretending to be the peacemaker. Mom's just upset, he said. She doesn't mean half of what she says. She wrote it down, Nathan, I said. She meant every word. He sighed. Look, she talked to a lawyer about changing the will. It's not official yet, but I don't care about the money. Maybe you should, he said. You'll regret it when you're older. I laughed bitterly. You mean when I become like her? He didn't answer. At the hospital, the whispers began almost immediately. Someone had seen the article, someone else had heard from a friend of a friend. A colleague pulled me aside one afternoon and said, Your mother's quite the character, isn't she? She called the board last week, said she was worried about your professional image. I froze. What? She said she was only trying to protect you. I told her you didn't need protection, you needed space. I thanked her and went back to my shift pretending my stomach hadn't turned to ice. That night, I told Daniel everything. He listened, quiet and steady as always. When I finished, he reached into his sketchbook and tore out a page. It was a design, another phoenix, this one smaller, its wings outlined in delicate gold. I'm going to tattoo this for you after the wedding, he said. It's for rebirth. I ran my fingers over the page. You really believe we can start over, don't you? He smiled. We already have. We spent the next few weeks planning the wedding. Nothing grand, just a small ceremony at his studio with a handful of friends and his family. I bought a simple dress. Lucia insisted on baking the cake herself. One evening, as I was leaving work, a courier handed me an envelope. The handwriting was unmistakable. Inside was a folded photo of Daniel and me, from the newspaper, torn down the middle, and a note in my mother's perfect cursive, If you go through with this, don't expect a seat at my table ever again. I read it once, twice, then slid it into my bag. I didn't cry. I didn't even shake. Later that night, I took the letter out and placed it in the bottom drawer of my dresser, right beside my father's old note, the one that said, Be kind even when kindness costs you everything. I looked at the two papers side by side, one born of love, one of control. Maybe kindness isn't staying quiet, I whispered. Maybe kindness is choosing yourself. When I crawled into bed, Daniel was already half asleep. I lay beside him, my hand resting on the curve of his arm, the ring glinting faintly in the streetlight. In a few days, we would be married. I would have a new name, a new home, a new family. What I didn't know was that love's next test was already forming, silent and cruel, waiting for the day we'd tell her about the baby. It started with a faint wave of nausea one morning at the hospital. I was midway through my shift when the smell of antiseptic and coffee made my stomach twist. I laughed it off at first, blaming lack of sleep and too many vending machine dinners. But when it happened again the next day, and the day after that, I bought a pregnancy test during my lunch break, hiding it in my coat pocket like contraband. The result appeared before I could even blink, two bright pink lines. I stared at them until the edges blurred my breath, catching somewhere between disbelief and wonder. When I told Daniel that night, I was trembling. You're serious, he whispered, his voice breaking into a laugh. He pulled me into his arms, spinning me once before setting me down carefully. We're having a baby. His joy was infectious. He kept repeating it as if saying the words out loud made them more real. We're going to be parents, Em. We spent the rest of that night sitting on the kitchen floor, eating cold pizza and imagining what our child might look like. Would she have my eyes? His smile when I finally went to bed, my hand rested instinctively on my stomach. A small heartbeat somewhere inside me was rewriting my story. For a few blissful weeks, it felt like the world had softened. We told no one except his parents. Lucia cried when she heard hugging me tight and calling me Mihija. Carlos started sketching crib designs in his workshop, insisting he'd build one himself. Their joy made me feel seen in a way I hadn't since childhood. I thought about calling my mother a dozen times. Every time I stopped just short of dialing. There was always that small, desperate voice whispering, maybe this will change her. Maybe this will melt her heart. By the second trimester I was showing, my scrubs didn't fit right anymore, and the nurses at work teased me gently about the glow I was supposedly radiating. I started collecting baby name lists, sketching nursery ideas, and writing letters to the child growing inside me. Finally, one quiet afternoon, I called my mother. When she picked up, her voice was perfectly composed. "Emily, it's been months." "I know," I said, forcing calm. "I wanted to see you. I have news." She paused, suspicious. "News, can I come by?" After a moment she said, "Fine, if you must." I told Daniel I wanted to do it alone. He looked uneasy but didn't argue. "If she hurts you again, she won't," I lied. "This is different." The drive to Beacon Hill was eerily familiar, the streets lined with wreaths and white lights. The same house stood there like a monument to appearances, every brick spotless, every window glowing with false warmth. She opened the door herself. Her hair was perfectly set, her pearls gleaming. "Emily," she said, looking me up and down, "you look substantial." I ignored the jab and followed her into the sitting room. Nathan was there, lounging on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I sat across from her, my hands folded over the swell of my belly. "I came because I have something to tell you." She lifted a brow. "You're not leaving that man, are you?" I shook my head. "I'm pregnant." The room fell silent. Even Nathan looked up. Her expression didn't change. At first it froze. Then, slowly, it curdled. "You're pregnant," she repeated the words, tasting bitter. "With his child," I nodded. "Yes. You're going to be a grandmother." Her face went through a series of emotions: shock, disgust, calculation, and then hardened. "You really are determined to drag this family's name through the mud." "Mom, please," I said, my throat tightening. "This is your grandchild." She laughed, sharp and humorless. "Don't call it that. I will not have that man's blood in my lineage." "You've made your bed, Emily. Lie in it." "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, quietly. "You're talking about your own daughter, your own grandchild." Her voice dropped to a whisper of venom. "You are not my daughter. Not anymore." Nathan shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. My hands trembled as I stood up. "I came here hoping for peace. But I see now you don't know what that means." "Close the door on your way out," she said. I did. A week later, an official envelope arrived in the mail. Inside was a notarized letter from the family's attorney confirming my removal from my father's estate. The words blurred together, but one sentence stood out in bold. "At the client's request, Emily Carter Morales is hereby excluded from any future distribution of assets." Excluded. The words stabbed deep, not for what it meant financially, but for what it declared: you are no longer part of us. Daniel found me sitting on the floor, the letter in my lap. "You knew this might happen," he said gently. "I thought she'd wait until the baby was born," I whispered. He knelt beside me, taking my face in his hands. "You don't need her money. You don't need her name. You have us." I nodded, but the tears came anyway. "It's not about money. It's about being erased." He held me until the sobs quieted, his hand resting on my stomach. "No one can erase this," he said. "No one." As the holidays approached, Daniel suggested inviting her to Christmas dinner. "Maybe if she sees you happy, sees how much you're loved, it'll change something." I wanted to believe him. I called her again, my voice trembling. "Mom, can we spend Christmas together, as a family?" There was a long silence. Then she said, "Daniel isn't invited. This will be a family-only celebration. He's my husband." "Then you can decide where you belong," she said, and hung up. For days I wrestled with what to do. Every logical part of me screamed not to go. But some stubborn, broken piece still hoped that seeing her face to face might fix something, that maybe love could still find its way through the cracks. So I decided to go. That week, I began preparing her Christmas gift. I spent hours wrapping it in silver paper, tying the ribbon just right. Inside, I placed the ultrasound photo of our baby girl and a small handwritten note that read, "For the grandmother you could have been." On Christmas Eve, as Daniel helped me into my coat, he said softly, "You don't have to do this." "I know," I replied, "but I need to." He kissed my forehead. "Then be careful, and remember you don't owe her anything." Driving through the city, I passed families carrying gifts, laughter spilling out of glowing windows. The radio played carols, but I couldn't hear the words. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The gift sat on the passenger seat beside me, small and unassuming yet heavy, with everything I'd never been able to say. When I pulled up to the house, snow had begun to fall. The lights gleamed in the windows, perfect and hollow. I took a deep breath and whispered to my belly, "Whatever happens tonight, you and I will be okay." Somewhere deep down I knew this Christmas wouldn't be a reunion. It would be a reckoning. The snow fell like powdered sugar over the city, soft and silent, disguising the ice beneath. I drove through the glowing streets of Beacon Hill, the world around me painted in silver and white. The small box sat on the passenger seat beside me, perfectly wrapped in silver paper, with a crimson ribbon resting there like a secret I couldn't keep any longer. I told myself it was just a dinner, a simple holiday visit. But deep down, I knew I was walking into a war zone disguised as Christmas. When I pulled up to the old brownstone, everything looked exactly as it always had, flawless. The wreath on the door was perfectly symmetrical. The windows glowed warm, and inside laughter drifted faintly through the glass. For a second, I almost turned back. But then I remembered Daniel's face that morning, his hand on my belly, his voice saying, "You don't owe her forgiveness." I rang the bell. My mother opened the door wearing a cream cashmere sweater and diamond earrings that caught the light like frost. She smiled that rehearsed, brittle smile. "Emily, dear, you look substantial." Her eyes flicked down to my stomach. I forced a smile. "It's good to see you too, Mom." She stepped aside. "Come in. Your brother and I were just finishing dinner." The living room gleamed like a magazine spread. The fire burned perfectly. The garland around the mantel looked freshly arranged. My father's photo still sat on the piano, smiling eternally, from a frame that matched nothing but my mother's sense of control. Nathan was sprawled across the couch, barefoot, wearing pajamas covered in cartoon reindeer. "Hey," he muttered without looking up from his phone. I hung my coat, taking in the scent of cinnamon and perfection. Every surface gleamed, every ornament was in its precise place. We sat at the dining table. My mother poured herself wine, none for me, of course. So she began in that tone she used for interviews and interrogations alike. "How have you been?" "I've been good," I said, "working at the hospital, keeping busy." "How charming." She smiled tightly. "Does Daniel still draw on people for a living?" I kept my tone even. "Yes. His studio's doing really well." "That's surprising." "I suppose there's a market for that sort of thing among a certain crowd." I swallowed. "He has clients from all over the city. People trust him with their stories." She arched a brow. "Stories. That's an interesting way to describe graffiti on skin." I smiled faintly. "You'd be surprised what art can mean to people, Mom." Nathan snorted. "Maybe he can tattoo a $sign on his forehead, might help business." I turned to him. "You're still living here, right?" He blinked. "What's that supposed to mean?" "Nothing," I said, cutting my food into tiny, trembling pieces. The air thickened. The only sound was the tick of the clock over the mantel and the soft clinking of silverware. Finally, I set my fork down. "I actually wanted to tell you both something." My mother glanced up, her face already tense. "Daniel and I are expecting a girl," I said softly. "You're going to be grandparents." Silence. The fire cracked. My brother froze mid-bite. My mother's hands, steady as stone, set her glass down with careful precision. For one impossible moment, I thought I saw tears in her eyes. Then her lips curved, not in joy but in triumph. "I don't want you or that bastard in this family," she said clearly, each word a dagger. "You're cut out of the will." The room went dead. Nathan looked at his plate. My mother lifted her glass again, sipping as though she'd simply delivered a weather report. My heart pounded, but my voice came out calm. "You've made that clear already." She tilted her head. "Then perhaps this time you'll listen." I pushed my chair back slowly. The sound echoed in the room. "You're right," I said. "This time I am listening." She blinked, maybe expecting me to argue to beg. But I didn't. I stood up, reached into my purse, and pulled out the silver box. "This is for you," I said, placing it gently beneath the Christmas tree. "Merry Christmas, Mother." She frowned. "What's this supposed to be, a gift? You'll understand when you open it." "Emily, don't be dramatic," she sighed, her patience thinning. "Sit down. We can discuss this like adults." I looked at her, the woman who'd built her entire identity on control, and for the first time I saw the fragility underneath it. "There's nothing left to discuss." I smoothed my coat, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders. "You once told me kindness was weakness. You were wrong. Walking away is harder." Her face twitched, but she didn't speak. I turned toward the door. Behind me, her voice rose. "If you leave now, don't come back." I paused at the threshold and looked over my shoulder. I wasn't planning to. The door clicked shut behind me, sealing years of noise and judgment inside that perfect house. Outside, the night was silent, except for the whisper of snow under my boots. The cold stung my face, but the air felt clean for the first time in months. I walked slowly to my car, my hand resting on my belly. When I reached the driver's seat, I sat for a moment, breathing hard. Through the window, the lights of her house gleamed gold against the dark, immaculate and distant. I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to belong there, twisting myself into shapes that fit her version of love. She thought she'd won tonight. She thought disowning me would break me, but she had no idea what she'd just lost. By the time I started the engine, the world outside had gone quiet. Snowflakes swirled in the headlights like ash. For years, I whispered, I begged for her love. Tonight, I gave her the truth she deserved. I drove through the sleeping streets, Christmas lights blinking faintly on balconies, families laughing inside their homes. Somewhere in the distance, church bells rang midnight. In that moment, I felt a strange calm settle over me, a calm that wasn't peace, but something close to it. I realized that silence could be louder than any scream, and truth could sting longer than hate. I didn't know what would happen when she opened the box, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever storm she started next, I wasn't going to stand in it anymore. What I didn't realize then was that 3 hours later, her screams would echo through the neighborhood, and every wall of that perfect house would shake with the truth she tried so hard to bury. It was almost midnight when my phone started to buzz against the nightstand. I was sitting in the parking lot of the hospital, hands still trembling on the steering wheel, watching snow dissolve into slush beneath the streetlights. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway. Emily, Nathan's voice came through, frantic and shaky. "What the hell did you put in that box?" I blinked, my throat tightening. "Why, she's been screaming for 20 minutes, he said, breathless. The neighbors called the cops. Dad called 911 because he thought she was having a heart attack. She won't stop. She keeps saying, 'The baby, the baby.'" "What did you do?" I closed my eyes and leaned my head against the seat. "I just gave her the truth." "What does that even mean?" he shouted. "She's losing her mind." I could almost see it. The perfect house in chaos for the first time in its history. Lights, blazing curtains, open neighbors whispering from porches. Margaret Carter's empire finally cracking. "She'll survive," I said quietly. "Emily, this isn't funny. The paramedics are here. I'm not laughing." He hesitated. "What's in the box?" I hesitated too, then said, "An ultrasound photo and a note. A note, 'This is the granddaughter you'll never know. Merry Christmas from the family you rejected.'" Nathan went silent on the other end, and for a moment all I could hear was the faint hum of sirens in the distance. She's crying now," he said finally. I've never seen her cry. Then maybe she's finally feeling something real, I whispered. You sound proud of yourself. No, I said, just done. I hung up before he could answer. The snow kept falling soft and relentless. I sat there in the car feeling something strange, a mix of grief, relief, and exhaustion. My phone buzzed again, but I turned it face down. When Daniel found me an hour later, he didn't say anything. He just got into the passenger seat and held my hand. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, and that small gesture was enough to undo me. I told her, I murmured. He nodded. I figured. She said I was dead to her. He looked at me for a long time, then let her bury the version of you she made up. That was the first time I cried that night. Not out of sadness, but because I realized I'd stopped trying to win. We drove home in silence, the city glowing faintly beneath the snow. When we got back to our apartment, Daniel made tea while I sat on the couch staring at the lights from the Christmas tree we'd decorated 2 weeks earlier. It was lopsided and imperfect, with a few ornaments missing because I'd dropped them and Daniel had insisted it gave the tree character. I thought about the one at my mother's house, the one that looked like a department store display, perfect, soulless, untouchable. For the first time, I felt pity instead of anger. Around 2 in the morning, the phone rang again. I let it ring until voicemail took it. Then another call came, and another. Finally, I answered, half expecting to hear my mother's voice. It was Nathan again. She's calm now, he said. The doctors say she's fine. Good. She's been asking for you. I'm sure she has. He hesitated. She said she didn't mean it. The things she said. I laughed softly. Nathan, she meant every word. She just didn't mean to face the consequences. You're really not coming back, no. But she's Mom, he said weakly. I closed my eyes. No, Nathan. She was Mom. The woman who raised me doesn't exist anymore. He didn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. I think she's scared. She should be, I said. She finally has to live with herself. I ended the call and turned off my phone completely. For the next few hours, I sat awake, while Daniel slept beside me, the sound of his breathing steady and reassuring. I stared at the small ultrasound photo on our fridge, the one that looked almost identical to the one I'd left in that silver box. The faint outline of our daughter, her tiny hand curled near her face. This, I whispered to the empty room, is the only family that matters now. Morning came slowly, spilling pale light across the apartment. I made coffee and watched the snowplows roll down the street. My phone remained off. The silence was strange but peaceful. At noon, I turned it back on. The screen lit up with dozens of missed calls and voicemails. My mother, Nathan, even one from the housekeeper, Mrs. Doyle. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I opened a new message and typed slowly. You made your choice, Mom. Now I'm making mine. I wish you peace. I sent it and immediately blocked her number. When Daniel woke up, I was still at the kitchen table, staring at the mug in my hands. He came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my shoulders. You okay? For the first time, I said, I think I am. He kissed my hair. Then it's over. Maybe, I said. But endings always echo for a while. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the city skyline, we went for a walk. The snow crunched under our boots, the world unusually quiet. When we passed a shop window, I caught our reflection, me, bundled in Daniel's scarf, my belly round beneath my coat, his hand resting over it protectively. I thought of my mother again, sitting in her perfect house, surrounded by everything she valued and nothing she loved. She'd lost her husband's respect, her daughter's trust, and now the chance to know her granddaughter. And somehow I knew she would never forgive herself, even if she could never admit it. That night when I lay in bed, I didn't dream of her voice or the sound of her anger. I dreamed of a small hand clutching mine, of sunlight, of peace. The next morning I woke to find Daniel already awake, staring at me with a small smile. You know, he said, you don't have to carry her shadow anymore. I know, I said. But part of me always will. He reached out, resting his hand on my stomach. Then maybe it's time to turn it into something else. Something that doesn't hurt. I smiled. Like love, he nodded. exactly like love. The days that followed passed quietly. The world felt lighter, softer, almost unfamiliar in its stillness. The phone stopped ringing, and my thoughts finally stopped circling around her. Sometimes I caught myself wondering if she'd ever open that box again, if she'd look at that picture and finally understand what she'd thrown away. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But the truth was, it didn't matter anymore. For the first time in my life, silence wasn't punishment. It was peace. What I didn't know then was that peace would be short-lived, that 3 weeks later, my mother would find a new way to reach me, one that would shake the fragile calm I had just begun to build. The morning after felt too quiet, as if the city itself had taken a deep breath and was waiting to exhale. I sat on the couch with a cup of coffee gone cold, watching flakes of snow drift lazily past the window. Daniel moved around the kitchen, humming softly while making breakfast. Every sound felt distant, like I was hearing it through water. The night before had ended, but its echoes hadn't left me. My phone buzzed again, another call from Nathan. I didn't answer. There were already 20 missed calls, stacked beneath his name, and a few from numbers I didn't recognize. I turned the phone face down on the table. Daniel looked over his shoulder. "Still calling, yay," I said. "He'll stop eventually." He set a plate in front of me, scrambled eggs, toast, nothing fancy. "You don't have to carry their mess anymore, Emily." "I know." I pushed the food around my plate but couldn't eat. "It's just strange." The quiet. He sat beside me. "Quiet isn't empty, it's just new." I wanted to believe him. Later that afternoon, I finally answered one of Nathan's calls. His voice came through, rushed and uneven. "She's not eating, Em. She barely sleeps. She keeps asking about you." I sighed. "Nathan, she's not herself," he interrupted. "Dad had to call a doctor. I think she's having some kind of breakdown." I rubbed my forehead, feeling the beginning of a headache. "She built a world out of control, Nathan. When it finally collapsed, what did you expect?" He went silent. "You sound like you don't care." "I care," I said quietly. "But I also care about staying sane." "She made her choice." He didn't reply, and for once I didn't fill the silence for him. When the call ended, I stood by the window for a long time, watching children play in the snow across the street. Their laughter floated up through the cold air, light and effortless. I envied them the way they lived without fear of being unloved. The next few months passed in a blur of small, steady things. I went back to work part-time at the hospital, my belly growing heavier with each passing week. The nurses joked that I glowed, though I mostly felt swollen and exhausted. Daniel's tattoo studio was thriving, his waiting list stretching months ahead. He came home every night with stories about clients, survivors, dreamers, people turning their pain into something beautiful. At home, he took care of everything. He cooked, cleaned, and rubbed my back when I couldn't sleep. Every time I felt the baby kick, he pressed his ear to my stomach and whispered, "That's my girl." There was peace in the small things: morning coffee, evening walks, laughter that came easily again. But sometimes in the quiet moments between day and night, I still felt her shadow watching from a distance. Then one morning, my best friend Sarah slid into the booth across from me at our favorite cafe. She looked nervous. "Your mom called me," she said. I froze halfway through stirring my tea. "What, she wanted to know how you're doing? Said she's worried about you." "About the baby?" I laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Worried about the same baby she called a mistake. I'm just telling you what she said," Sarah replied gently. "She mentioned family therapy. That maybe if you all sat down." "No," I cut her off. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Sarah. She didn't accidentally hurt my feelings. She deliberately rejected me." Sarah reached across the table. "She's still your mother." I pulled my hand back. "Being a mother doesn't give you a license to destroy your child and call it love." Her eyes softened. "You really don't think she can change? Not unless control stops being her religion." We finished our tea in silence. When I walked home through the snow, I realized something: pity had replaced anger. And pity was the final stage of letting go. At 28 weeks pregnant, I started writing letters to my unborn daughter, tiny notes, in a notebook I kept on my nightstand. I told her about courage, about boundaries, about how love should never hurt. I promised her she'd never have to earn my affection, that she'd grow up in a home where she could breathe freely. One night after I finished writing, Daniel came up behind me and read a few lines over my shoulder. "You'll never have to earn my love," he whispered. "I like that one." I smiled. "It's a promise." He kissed the top of my head. "You're going to be an amazing mom." "I just hope I'm the kind she deserves," I said. "She already has that," he said simply. We went to bed, and for the first time in a long time I slept without dreams. A few days later, a thick envelope arrived at Daniel's studio with no return address. He thought it was a client request. When he opened it, his expression changed. Inside were photographs grainy taken from a distance. One showed me walking into the hospital. Another captured us leaving the grocery store, Daniel pushing a cart while I held my belly. The last one was the most unsettling, a close-up of our apartment building, the nursery window visible behind the curtain. When he brought them home, I felt my stomach twist. "Who sent these? There's no note," he said. "But I think we both know who." I sank into the couch, my pulse pounding. "She's watching us." Daniel sat beside me, his jaw tight. "We'll go to the police if we have to." "She's not breaking any laws," I said bitterly. "Just boundaries." That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the building made me tense. I got up and checked the locks 3 times before crawling back into bed. Daniel pulled me close, whispering, "She can't reach you here. She's already lost." But I wasn't sure he was right. Because the thing about people like my mother was, they didn't stop when you escaped. They just found new ways to haunt you. The next morning I opened the curtains. Across the street a dark sedan sat idling. For a second I thought I saw the flicker of a camera lens. But when I blinked, it was gone. Maybe I was imagining it. Or maybe she was reminding me that peace was never meant to last. I turned away from the window and looked at the ultrasound picture pinned to the fridge. The baby's tiny profile, her hand raised near her face. It was proof that life continued even after the past tried to bury it. "I won't let her touch you," I whispered. That evening, Nathan called again. I almost didn't answer, but something in me said I should. "Dad moved out," he said quietly. "They're divorcing." He found out about the money. "What money?" "The check she wrote me," he said. "Over $40,000 in 2 years. He thought it was for charity." I let out a low breath. "And now she's unraveling, Em. She's obsessed with you. She hired someone to follow you." I told her to stop, but she won't listen. My throat went dry. "You need to make her stop, Nathan." "I'm trying," he said, "but she only listens when she wants to." When we hung up, I sat there for a long time, feeling the baby move inside me. Each kick felt like a reminder of what mattered. I walked into the nursery, touching the edge of the crib Carlos had built. The wood smelled like fresh pine. I placed my hand on my belly and spoke softly. "You will never inherit her fear. I promise you that." Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the street in silence. I thought the war was over. I thought I had escaped the house that made me. But some walls follow you wherever you go. Lily Grace Morales arrived 3 weeks early in the middle of a spring thunderstorm. The rain was hammering against the hospital windows when I felt the first contraction. Daniel nearly tripped over his shoes getting me to the car. By the time we reached the maternity ward, the nurses were already smiling like they knew how the story would end. Labor was long, but mercifully uncomplicated. When they placed her on my chest, tiny, pink, and furious, I couldn't breathe for a second. Her cry was raw and perfect, a sound that split me open and stitched me back together in the same moment. Daniel was crying too, laughing through the tears. "She has your eyes," he said, voice shaking, "and your stubborn chin." I looked down at her, at that tiny mouth, and the way her fingers curled instinctively around my thumb. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered. "You're home now." For the next few days, the hospital room became our little universe. Daniel slept in the uncomfortable chair, waking every time Lily made the smallest noise. Lucia and Carlos arrived with flowers and homemade soup. Lucia wept openly, rocking Lily while whispering Spanish lullabies. Carlos kissed my forehead and said, "You did good, mija. You did real good." No calls came from Beacon Hill, and for once, that silence didn't sting. When we finally brought Lily home, the apartment felt smaller but warmer. Every corner smelled like baby powder and new beginnings. Daniel took a week off from the studio, and his family came by daily, filling the rooms with laughter and casseroles. At night, when the house was quiet, except for Lily's soft breathing, I would sit in the rocking chair and watch the city lights flicker through the curtains. I felt peace, not the kind that hides from pain, but the kind that grows from surviving it. "This is our family now," Daniel said one night as we watched her sleep. "Yes," I whispered. "The one we chose." Weeks turned into months. Lily grew fast, bright-eyed, curious, always reaching for the world around her. She loved music, the sound of Daniel's voice, the way sunlight filtered across the crib in the mornings. I went back to work part-time at the hospital. My coworkers greeted me with hugs and stories, showering me with tiny gifts. Daniel's tattoo studio, Phoenix Ink., was thriving. He'd been featured in Boston Creatives, the local art magazine. The photo showed him standing by a mural of a phoenix rising over the city skyline. The caption read, "Turning scars into art." When he brought the magazine home, I kissed him and said, "You're kind of a big deal now." He smiled. "Not compared to you." But peace in my life always came with a shadow. One afternoon, while Lily and I were in the park, Daniel called. His voice was tense. "A letter came to the shop," he said. "From who, no return address. It's pictures again." My chest tightened. "Pictures of what, you and Lily?" "From this week." I froze, watching my daughter chase sunlight with her tiny hands. "You mean someone's been following us?" "I think so," he said. "The photos were taken from across the street. Emily, this isn't just curiosity anymore." When we got home, he showed me the envelope. Inside were glossy prints, me pushing the stroller, Daniel holding Lily at the grocery store, a close-up of our apartment building. Each photo was marked with a date in red pen. "She's behind this," I said flatly. Daniel didn't argue. "I'll call the police tomorrow." I shook my head. "She's too careful. She probably used someone else's name, paid cash. They won't find anything." That night I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside made me flinch. I got up 3 times to check the locks and peek through the curtains. The street was empty, just snow melting under the streetlights, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching. Around 3 a.m., I picked Lily up from her crib and held her close. Her warmth grounded me, her tiny breath against my neck, reminding me that the past couldn't win unless I let it. Daniel found me there an hour later. "You okay?" "She's not going to stop," I said. "Then we'll stop her," he replied, wrapping his arms around both of us. A week later, an article appeared in the Boston Gazette, tucked into the society section. "Rumors of reconciliation in the Carter family, sources suggest grandmother eager to mend fences." My stomach turned. There was even a blurry picture of me from months earlier at the hospital, smiling in scrubs. "She's creating her own narrative," I said, tossing the paper aside, trying to make herself look like the victim. Daniel nodded grimly. "Let her talk. We know the truth." But that wasn't the end of it. One afternoon, as I was folding laundry, the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, a bouquet of white lilies sat on the step. No card, no name, just flowers. I froze. She knew our address. That night, after Lily fell asleep, Daniel found me sitting at the kitchen table with the flowers still untouched in their vase. "We can't live like this," he said. "I'll file for a restraining order if I have to." I nodded. Maybe that's what it takes. But before we could do anything, another knock came, this time real and human. When I opened the door, Nathan stood there shivering in the cold. He looked thinner, older, his once perfect hair a mess. "Hey," he said quietly. "Can I come in?" I didn't answer right away. "What do you want, Nathan? I need to talk to you, please." Daniel stepped forward, crossing his arms. About what Nathan's eyes darted between us. About Mom. And about Dad. They're getting divorced. The words hung in the air like frost. What I whispered? She's unraveling, he said. Dad found out about the money, how she's been giving me thousands over the years, lying about it. They're fighting constantly. He moved out last week. I just stared at him, too stunned to speak. She's obsessed with you, Nathan went on. She has this scrapbook, Emily. It's full of photos, articles, everything she can find about you and Daniel. She even has clippings about the baby. It's creepy. Daniel's jaw clenched. That's not obsession. That's stalking. Nathan looked ashamed. I know, and I let it happen. She said she was protecting the family, and I believed her. I crossed my arms, feeling the old ache of betrayal rise again. Why are you telling me this now? Because I want to make it right, he said. I'm getting my own apartment, a real job. I want to be Lily's uncle, not the brother who watched our mother destroy everything. For a long moment, no one spoke. The baby monitor hummed faintly in the background, a lullaby echoing through static. I studied his face, searching for the arrogance that used to define him. It wasn't there. All I saw was regret. You can start, I said finally, by respecting my boundaries. No information goes back to her. No photos, no updates, nothing. He nodded quickly. Understood. And if you mean it, Daniel added, prove it, with action, not words. Nathan met his gaze. I will. After he left, I stood at the window watching him disappear into the falling snow. She's losing everything, I said quietly. Daniel came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist. Maybe that's how she learns what matters. I looked down at the lights of the street, at the faint reflection of my daughter sleeping peacefully in the crib behind me. Or maybe she never learns at all. Snow began to fall harder, covering the city in a soft, forgiving white. I thought I had escaped her world, but some ghosts don't vanish, they just change shape. Still, as I watched my little family bathed in the warm light of our home, I made myself a promise. Whatever haunted her would end with me. The knock came on a Sunday morning, just as sunlight began to slip through the blinds. Daniel was feeding Lily in the kitchen, humming under his breath when I opened the door to find Nathan standing there. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, eyes, hollow shoulders slumped beneath a wrinkled jacket. Emily, he said quietly, I need to talk to you. I stepped aside without a word, and he walked in, clutching a worn envelope in his hands. Daniel glanced up from the high chair, studying him warily. Coffee, he asked flatly. No thanks, Nathan said. His voice was hoarse. I won't stay long. He stood in the middle of our small living room, glancing around at the toys scattered across the floor. The framed photos on the wall, Daniel holding Lily in the hospital, the three of us at the park. Something flickered across his face, something like shame. Dad left, he said finally. I frowned. Left where? The house, the marriage, everything. He's living in a condo downtown now. I didn't answer. He reached into the envelope and pulled out a sheaf of papers. The divorce is official next week. It's all over. And there's more. I sat down slowly. Go on. He found out about the money, Nathan said, his voice breaking a little. The checks she wrote me. The ones I told you about. $43,000 in 2 years. She told him it was for charity donations. He checked the accounts and everything unraveled. I stared at him, not out of surprise, but something closer to exhaustion. And what did he do? He lost it, Nathan whispered. He said she'd been living a lie, that she cut you out for marrying someone beneath her while secretly paying her son to stay a failure. He called her a hypocrite in front of the lawyers. Daniel gave a small, humorless laugh. So the kingdom finally fell. Nathan looked down. Yeah. And she's taking it hard. She barely eats, barely leaves the house. I think she's losing herself. I leaned back against the couch, feeling both relief and something that wasn't quite joy. It's what she built her life on, Nathan. Image, control. Once those things are gone, what's left? He swallowed. That's not why I came here. Then why are you here? He hesitated before pulling out a photograph from the envelope. It was taken from a distance, slightly blurry, but the subject was unmistakable, me walking with Lily in her stroller. She didn't stop, he said quietly. She's still having you followed. Daniel's jaw tightened. Are you serious? She hired a new investigator after you got the restraining order. Warning, Nathan said. She told him she needed updates for the court, in case she ever decided to file for custody rights. Custody, I repeated. Of my child. Nathan nodded miserably. She thinks you're unfit, that you're emotionally unstable. She's planning to use her lawyers to request visitation rights, says you're keeping her granddaughter from her. For a second, the room went silent, except for the faint sound of Lily gurgling in the next room. Daniel stood up, pacing, his fists clenched. That's it. I'm done being polite. She's crossed every line there is. I pressed a hand to my chest, trying to breathe through the rising panic. She can't take Lily. She can't even get close. She won't. Daniel said, his voice low and steady now. Not while I'm here. Nathan sat down on the edge of the chair, head in his hands. I'm sorry, he whispered. For everything. For the years I let her control both of us. For being too cowardly to stop her. I looked at him for a long moment. The golden boy of the Carter family, the one who could do no wrong, now sitting in my living room, stripped of pride, begging for forgiveness. You can't change the past, I said softly. But you can decide what you do from here. He looked up, eyes glistening. I want to be part of Lily's life, if you'll let me. I want to be the kind of uncle she deserves. Daniel crossed his arms, studying him. And how do we know you won't run back to her the first time she calls? Because I already told her no, Nathan said. I told her I'm done letting her use me. I searched his face, looking for any sign of deceit, but all I saw was guilt and something unfamiliar, resolve. Then prove it, I said. No more lies, no more updates. If you want to know us, you have to leave her world completely. I already have, he said. I moved out last week. I'm renting a room near the North End. I found a job with a furniture design firm. Something inside me softened. Good, then start there. For the next hour we talked. He asked about Lily, about Daniel's studio, about my work at the hospital. Every answer seemed to surprise him, like he'd never imagined I could build a life without their approval. When he left, he hugged me for the first time in years. I'm proud of you, he whispered. It took me a second to respond. I hope you're proud of yourself too. After the door closed, Daniel exhaled heavily. You trust him? Not yet, I said, but maybe someday. That night, after putting Lily to bed, I sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. For so long, I'd imagined revenge would feel like triumph. But it didn't. It felt like silence after a storm, the kind that leaves everything standing but changed forever. She lost everything, I murmured. Dad, her money, her reputation. Even Nathan. Daniel came up behind me, resting his hands on my shoulders. Karma doesn't miss anyone, Em. It just takes its time. I smiled faintly. She always said I was too emotional, too soft. Maybe that's what saved me. He bent down and kissed my temple. You don't have to carry her story anymore. I know, I said, but maybe I can rewrite the ending. Later that night, the phone rang again. I almost ignored it, but the name flashing on the screen made my blood run cold. Carter family attorney. I answered, my voice steady. This is Emily. Miss Morales, the voice on the other end said, calm and professional. I'm calling on behalf of Mrs. Carter. She's filed a preliminary petition for grandparent visitation rights. You'll be receiving the court documents within the week. My throat tightened. She won't stop. I just thought you should be informed, the lawyer said before hanging up. Daniel was already watching me from across the room. What now? She's trying to use the courts, I said. She wants Lily. He crossed the room in 2 strides and pulled me into his arms. Then we'll fight her, together. I rested my head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She's lost everything, I whispered. This is all she has left, control. He tilted my chin up gently. Then it's time she learns she can't control you anymore. Outside snow had begun to fall again, coating the world in a deceptive quiet. I looked down at Lily sleeping in her crib, her tiny hand curled near her face, unaware of the storm her grandmother was about to start. "She thinks she's protecting the family," I said softly, "but she's just burning what's left of it." Daniel kissed the top of my head. "Let her burn it. We'll build something new from the ashes." And as I stood there watching the snow settle against the window, I realized he was right. The past had taken enough from me. Now it was my turn to fight, not out of revenge but for peace. The letter from the court arrived on a Wednesday morning, slipped neatly through the mail slot like any other piece of mail. But when I saw the return address, Suffolk County Family Court, my heart dropped straight into my stomach. I didn't need to open it to know what it said. Daniel found me standing in the doorway, envelope in hand. "It's her, isn't it?" I nodded. "She's actually doing it." He reached for the letter. "Do you want me to read it?" I shook my head and tore it open myself. The words blurred together at first: formal, sterile, merciless. Petition for grandparent visitation rights. Filed by Margaret L. Carter. She claimed concern for the child's welfare, citing my emotional instability, strained family ties, and questionable domestic environment. By the time I reached the signature line, my hands were shaking. "She's still trying to own me," I whispered, now through Lily. Daniel took the paper from me and set it on the counter. "We'll get a lawyer. We'll do it the right way this time." The following week, we sat in a small office downtown that smelled faintly of old coffee and printer ink. Across from us, a woman named Judith Meyer, a family law attorney with kind eyes and sharp words, flipped through the file. "She's not asking for custody," Judith said, "just visitation. But she's using the emotional distress angle. It's a manipulation tactic. Unfortunately, it's common." I stared at the polished edge of her desk. "She's trying to make me look unfit." "She's trying to make you bend," Judith corrected. "But if you've already established boundaries, that's what she's really fighting. Control." Daniel squeezed my hand. "So what do we do?" Judith leaned back in her chair. "We respond formally. File a counterclaim, and if necessary, request a restraining order for continued harassment. You have every right to protect your child and your peace." I nodded, but my throat was tight. "This never ends, does it?" Judith's expressions softened. "It ends when you stop reacting to her fear. People like your mother thrive on chaos. They mistake it for connection." The words hit harder than I expected. 2 weeks later, the hearing date was set. That morning, I dressed simply: dark trousers, cream blouse, no jewelry except my wedding ring. Daniel kissed me before we left. "No matter what she says in there," he told me, "you've already won. You're not her anymore." The courthouse was cold, its marble floors echoing every nervous footstep. When the bailiff called our names, I walked into the small courtroom and saw her for the first time in almost a year. Margaret Carter sat at the petitioner's table in a tailored gray suit, her hair perfectly styled, her posture still regal. But something in her eyes had changed. They weren't sharp anymore, just tired, almost frantic. She didn't look at me. The judge, a middle-aged woman with steel gray hair and a calm, steady tone, began reviewing the files. "Mrs. Carter, I've read your petition. You claim concern for the welfare of your granddaughter, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor," my mother said, her voice trembling. "Just enough to sound fragile. My daughter has, well, she's been distant. I only wish to be part of my granddaughter's life before it's too late." The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Morales, would you like to respond?" I stood, my palms damp. "My mother and I are estranged," I said evenly. "She made it clear she didn't want me or my child in her life. I've respected that wish. I have no interest in exposing my daughter to that kind of rejection." My mother's lawyer jumped in. "Your Honor, my client deeply regrets the harsh words spoken during a period of grief and confusion," I interrupted, unable to stop myself. "She wasn't confused. She was cruel. She called my baby a bastard on Christmas morning." The room went still. Even the court reporter paused, eyes flicking up from the keyboard. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Carter, is that true?" My mother blinked rapidly, her composure cracking for a second. It was a misunderstanding, she said. I was emotional. I didn't mean you meant it, I said quietly. You've meant everything you've done since. Daniel reached for my hand under the table. The judge sighed. Mrs. Carter, this court is not in the business of repairing emotional wounds. We are here to determine what's in the best interest of the child. Tell me, how is dragging your daughter through legal proceedings beneficial to your granddaughter? My mother's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The judge turned to me. Do you have evidence of continued harassment? I nodded and handed over a folder, photos, letters, the anonymous envelopes, even the newspaper clipping. The judge flipped through them slowly. This is extensive, she said, and deeply concerning. My mother sat stiffly, her face pale now. When the judge finally spoke again, her tone was final. Mrs. Carter, your request for visitation is denied. Furthermore, I recommend you seek counseling before any future contact with your daughter or her family. The gavel struck once, sharp and clean. I didn't look at my mother as the bailiff dismissed us. I just stood, collected my things, and walked out. Daniel followed silently. Outside, the air felt raw and sharp against my lungs. Snow had started again, the flakes swirling in the gray light. I was halfway down the courthouse steps when I heard her voice. Emily, wait. I stopped. She stood at the top of the stairs, her hands trembling, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to live without a family. I turned slowly. For the first time she looked small, smaller than I ever thought she could be. You could have had one, I said softly. You just didn't want the real kind. Tears welled in her eyes. Do you hate me? I shook my head. No, I just stopped needing you. She stepped forward like she wanted to reach for me, but I took a step back. I hope you find peace, I said, even if it's not with me. Her shoulders sagged. She looked down, then turned and walked away, her figure fading into the falling snow. Daniel slipped his arm around me. You okay? I think so, I said. It's strange. I thought I'd feel angry or relieved. But all I feel is done. We drove home in silence, the city lights glowing faintly through the snow. When we walked through the door, Lily was awake, cooing softly in her crib. I lifted her into my arms, her warmth grounding me in a way nothing else could. You'll never have to earn love, I whispered against her soft hair. You already have it. Daniel watched from the doorway, smiling. You sound like your dad when you say things like that. I looked up. Maybe that's the real inheritance he left me. He crossed the room, kissed me gently, and wrapped his arms around both of us. That night, after Lily was asleep, I tucked the court letter and the judge's ruling into a folder labeled closure. For the first time, the word didn't feel like a wish. It felt like the truth. A week later, Nathan stopped by with coffee. He looked lighter, steadier. Mom sold the house, he said. She's moving to Vermont. Said she needs a fresh start. I nodded slowly. Maybe she finally means it. He smiled. She left something for you. He handed me a small envelope. Inside was a faded photograph of me as a child sitting on my father's shoulders at the beach. On the back, in her elegant handwriting, were 4 words, I'm sorry. Be happy. I stared at the picture for a long time. Maybe this is the closest she'll ever get to love, I said quietly. Nathan squeezed my hand. Maybe it's enough. When he left, I stood by the window watching the last of the snow melt on the street below. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted. For the first time, peace didn't feel like a dream. It felt like home. Snow was falling again, soft and slow, a year to the day since everything broke apart. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine, the kind of scent that wrapped itself around your heart and whispered, you made it. Daniel was on the floor helping Lily hang ornaments on the tree, though most of them ended up clustered on the bottom branches within her tiny reach. She giggled every time one clinked against another. Last Christmas, I'd walked out of my mother's house with nothing but a box and a heartbeat inside me. This Christmas, that heartbeat was running around the living room, wearing reindeer pajamas and glitter on her cheeks. Daniel looked up, his eyes soft. You realize this tree's a structural hazard, right? It's perfect, I said, smiling. Every bit of it. He laughed, adjusting one of Lily's crooked ornaments. I guess imperfection is the new tradition. I sat back on the couch watching them. The glow of the lights painted the room gold. Somewhere in the background, Bing Crosby sang about dreaming of a white Christmas, and for once, I didn't flinch at the word family. This was home now, a messy, living, laughing thing. After Lily went down for her nap, I slipped out onto the porch. The cold air bit gently at my face, and the street lay still under a quilt of snow. 1 year ago, I would have felt lonely standing here. Now, I just felt quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't ache. When I went back inside, Daniel was making cocoa in the kitchen, humming to himself. Mail came earlier, he said. It's on the counter. I saw the envelope before he said it. Cream-colored, no return address. My mother's handwriting. For a long time, I didn't move. Then, I opened it carefully, half expecting venom, half expecting silence. Inside was a short note written in her looping script. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you're living the life I never had the courage to choose. Merry Christmas, Emily. Mom. A small photograph slipped out, a picture of me as a baby bundled in red, sitting on her lap beside a fireplace. Her smile was genuine in that picture. We were both still whole. I traced the edge of the photo with my thumb. For a long moment, I just stood there, the weight of everything she'd done and everything she'd lost pressing softly against my chest. Then I smiled because for the first time I didn't feel hate. Maybe love doesn't die. Maybe it just waits for us to stop fighting it. I tucked the photo into a frame on the mantel between one of my father and another of Lily. 3 generations past, present, and future finally side by side. By evening, the house filled with laughter and the sound of dishes clinking. Lucia and Carlos came over with food, and Nathan arrived last, shaking snow from his coat, holding a small wooden box in his hands. It's for Lily, he said shyly, setting it on the table. When she opened it, the soft melody of a lullaby spilled into the room. Inside, a tiny phoenix carved from cedar turned slowly in the light. It's beautiful, I said, my throat tight. Nathan smiled. For her, because she was born from fire and learned to sing anyway. Lucia wiped at her eyes. Carlos clinked his glass. Daniel leaned over and whispered, Your brother's a poet now. I guess we both learned something, I said. We toasted to family, to love, to second chances. Lily clapped when the glasses met, laughing like she understood. And in that moment, every piece of me that had ever broken felt stitched together by something stronger than forgiveness, understanding. After everyone left, the house grew quiet again. I tucked Lily into bed, kissed her soft hair, and stood watching her breathe. Her tiny fingers twitched in her sleep like she was still reaching for something. I brushed one curl from her forehead and whispered, You already have everything you'll ever need. In the living room, the fire burned low. Daniel handed me a mug of cocoa and sat beside me on the couch. The lights from the tree flickered across his face. Do you ever think about her? He asked gently. Sometimes, I said, but not with anger anymore. Just gratitude. She taught me who I didn't want to be. He smiled faintly. That's its own kind of gift. I leaned my head on his shoulder. You know, for the longest time I thought inheritance meant money or reputation. But it's not. It's the courage to love even when you've been hurt. That's what I'll leave for her. He reached over, taking my hand. Then she's already rich. Outside, the snow fell thicker, blurring the world into silence. The kind of silence that holds instead of hollows. I thought about the letter again, about how even after everything my mother had found a way to say be happy. Maybe that was enough. Daniel set his mug down and whispered, You broke the cycle, Em? I smiled. No, we did. For a long time, neither of us spoke. We just sat there watching the lights dance on the walls, the sound of Lily's soft breathing echoing from down the hall. If you had told me a year ago that I'd find peace, I wouldn't have believed you. But here, it was not in grand gestures or perfect endings, but in the small, steady moments that make up a life. Maybe that's what family really is, a collection of moments where you choose love over fear again and again. I looked out the window where the snow was still falling, endless and gentle. Last Christmas, I said softly, I lost my family. This Christmas, I realized I was never out of love. The fire flickered low and the house settled into the kind of stillness that feels alive. So, if you're still listening to my story, I want to ask you something. Have you ever had to rebuild your family from scratch? Have you ever had to find peace on your own terms? Because if you have, I think you already know you were never truly alone. Leave a comment below and tell me how you found your way back to yourself. And if you believe like I do that love and truth always find their way home, make sure to like this story and subscribe for more. Until next time, keep your light warm. And remember, peace isn't something you're given, it's something you choose.